is a symbol. It speaks to the nation's history and soul. The pattern which emerges when the flag unfurls tells us something about the country, about its birth, its growth, its history, the trials and the glories and the hopes of those who fly it. Our national flag has been described by the College of Heralds as one of the great flags of history, having regard to its heraldry, its history, its traditions, and its beauty. Let us now examine the flag and understand a little more about its composition and the significance of its various parts. The flag has been very carefully designed, and if you look carefully, you will find it is twice as long as it is wide. There are two quarters, the upper and lower next to the flagpole, known as the upper and lower hoist or canton of the flag. In the upper hoist is the Union Jack. In the lower hoist, the seven-pointed Federation Star. The two quarters farther from the flagpole are known as the fly of the flag. You'll see it is occupied by 5 stars, the Southern Cross. And if you look again at the flag, you will find that the predominant background colour is blue. You may wonder, who decided that these would be the component parts of our flag, and what do they all mean anyway? First of all, let us look at the Federation Star with its 7 points. This takes us back to the beginning of the 20th century, the first day of which was the 1st of January 1901. In the decades prior to this, there was a growing feeling among Australians that they had a separate national identity, that they were no longer a colony of Great Britain. They wanted to be seen as an independent nation. Australia had grown up, they said, become of age, able to manage its own affairs. In the mood of the times, there was a new feeling of unity, that the barriers between the colonies, as they were known, should be broken down. As one poet wrote, "From all division let our land be free, for God hath made her one. Complete she lies within the unbroken circle of the skies, and round her, indivisible, the sea breaks on her single shore." You may read in your history books how Australia ceased to be a colony and how the Commonwealth of Australia was inaugurated on the 1st of January 1901. And those who were alive at that time saw a new century, a new nation, and of course their thoughts turned to a new flag, a flag that would reflect that new nation. During these very important years, it was inevitable that there would be discussions about an appropriate flag. Up till that time, Australian colonies had used the Union Jack as the national flag. Without going into details, a national competition for a new flag was held with over 32,000 entries. There were popular designs with kangaroos, koalas, boomerangs, stars and stripes, even an emu playing with cricket balls, because cricket in those days was part of the new Australian ethos. Eminent Australians were appointed as judges, and finally they came up with our present design as we know it, and it was selected and approved. Not only was there a design for a new flag, but there was a competition for a suitable ode for the occasion. And the prize went to the well-known Toowoomba poet, George Essex Evans, for his poem, Commonwealth Day, in which he penned the immortal lines, "For on this day a flag is raised, a triumph won, a nation born." The Australian national flag was unfurled for the first time over the exhibition building in Melbourne on the 3rd of September 1901 by the Countess of Hopetown and by our first Prime Minister. On the 16th of September, it was unfurled officially for the first time by the Governor-General, the Earl of Hopetown, who happened to be in Queensland and who officiated at the opening of the Townsville Town Hall. The Federation Star originally had 6 points, one to represent each of the states. Later, when Australia began to gather additional territories, such as New Guinea, an extra point was added. So it now has 7 points. But of course, when New Guinea became independent, the point for the New Guinea Star perhaps had little relevance. And so the 7th point in the star includes now our territories, such as Northern Territory, which is not yet a state, the ACT, our Antarctic territories, Cocos Island, and other areas which are not states but which are part of the Commonwealth of Australia. It's a reminder that our Commonwealth of Australia is a Commonwealth, a united nation. If you look carefully at the topmost point of the Federation Star, you will find that it is designed to point directly to the centre of the Cross of St George, and that is done with great significance. Let us now have a look at the Southern Cross. This constellation of stars was long associated with the discovery of the great south land, Terra Australis, a guide to early travellers and explorers. And it appeared on many of the 19th century Australian flags. It's worth noting that the Southern Cross was well known to the Aborigines, an outdoor people who had legends for all the heavenly bodies. If you read in this book, The First Sunrise by Charles Mountford, you will find a delightful story about Mululu and his 4 daughters explaining the Aboriginal version of the Southern Cross. It is said, of course, that the Southern Cross never sets in Australia. One of the earlier great poets of history referred to the Southern Cross as representing the virtues of prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude, all of which are great qualities essential to a great nation. And so it's appropriate that the Southern Cross should be part of our national flag. The fly of the Australian flag is charged with the Southern Cross, the brightest constellation in the Southern Hemisphere. These stars make a distinctive design for our flag and a beautiful symbol for Australia. So said the judges in 1901. Of course, there are other points of interest about the stars in the Southern Cross. They're not just thrown there in any sort of fashion. Each star is carefully positioned in a geometrical pattern in accordance with the rules of heraldry. You will note that each of the stars has 7 points, except the small inner centre star, which has 5. So the Southern Cross is a very significant part of our national flag. You may ask then, why did they choose blue and not some other colour as the predominant colour of our flag? Why blue and not yellow or gold or green? The colour of blue should be a reminder of our heritage, which stems from the sea, the blue of the sea that surrounds this island continent. Across the uncharted seas came the first explorers, the first settlers. The foundations of the settlement were laid by the 4 great governors, the first 4 great governors, all of whom were naval officers. And over the centuries, Britain acquired a great naval tradition which we in Australia have inherited. Then there is the colour of our sky. So much of our tradition has been built around the sea and the sky that the blue is highly significant colour for our flag. Perhaps the most interesting question, and one upon which so few people are aware, is the question of the Union Jack in the flag. Why did the designers insert the Union Jack in the corner of the flag? If you looked at all the earlier flags in the 19th century, you would find always that that was part of the flag. It may be that our early settlers had these strong links with Great Britain, but the reasons for the Union Jack in the corner of our flag go much deeper than that. The basic institutions of our society have come to us as part of this British heritage. Our Westminster system of government, for example, was hammered out over the centuries, beginning with Simon de Montfort's first Parliament in 1265 AD. Our legal system, the heritage of the English common law, trial by jury, and basic concepts such as the Habeas Corpus Act, these have come to us from Britain. The liberty of the subject, which we prize so much, dates back to 1215 AD, when barons forced King John to sign Magna Carta. And so we could go on. Our major sporting codes, our language, our literature, all these are part of our British heritage. So it's right and proper that these origins should be reflected in our national flag. Let's go a little deeper and examine the national flag, especially the Union Jack in the corner. You'll note that there are three crosses in that Union Jack. First of all, the cross of St. George. Look carefully at the flag, which shows a red cross on a white field, the cross of St. George. St. George, the patron saint of England, lived in the 3rd and 4th centuries. We believe he was born in Cappadocia, which is part of modern Turkey, of noble Christian parents. He became a professional soldier in the Roman army and rose to high rank with a great reputation for courage and bravery. When the Roman emperor of the day, Diocletian, outlawed Christianity, he resigned his commission and urged the emperor to change his views. In this he was unsuccessful, and as a result of his attitudes, he was put to death on the 23rd of April, 303 AD. After his death, many legends arose about his bravery. Some of you may have read the story of St. George and the slaying of the dragon. How St. George became protector of England is lost in antiquity, but it probably had Christian and military associations. It is known that his name was well known in England before the Norman conquest in the 11th century. There is evidence that the Crusaders used the red cross on a white background on their shields. By 1194, it was a popular banner of England. During the period of Edward III, St. George was made the patron saint of England and associated with the Order of the Garter about the year 1348. At that time, Edward III founded the Chapel of St. George at Windsor, and no doubt some of you may wish to see that when you travel abroad in the future. Those of you who have read Shakespeare's Henry V will recall Henry's inspiring call to arms at the gates of Harfleur. God for Harry, England and St. George was his rallying cry. So the cross of St. George over the centuries became identified with courage, bravery and Christian ideals. In time it became the symbol of mercy and was adopted as the symbol of the International Red Cross Society. Later still, the George Cross became an award for gallantry. The cross of St. George in the Union Jack and now in our national flag has a history and tradition going back many, many centuries. The second cross, the cross of St. Andrew. Look now at the white cross on the blue background. The cross of St. Andrew patron saint of Scotland. Again, we go back to the early Christian period of the 1st century. We know that Andrew was born in Galilee, brother to Simon Peter. He's mentioned in the Bible on many occasions, and we learn that he laid down his fishing nets and decided to follow Christ. As one of Christ's 12 apostles, he preached the gospel in Asia Minor, along the Black Sea, and in Greece. Andrew was crucified at Patras on the Gulf of Corinth on a slanting cross. As he said, he was not worthy to be crucified on one like that which had borne his Lord. His remains were carefully preserved at Constantinople, and when Greece became Christian, Andrew was chosen to be the patron saint of Patras, and because of his origins as a fisherman, he became honoured as the patron saint of all fishermen. How then did St Andrew become the patron saint of Scotland? Several centuries later, Christian missionaries were attempting to convert the warring tribes of the Picts and the Scots in Scotland. They were attempting to convert them to Christianity, and they were having a difficult time of it. So about the year 740 AD, relics of St Andrew were presented to Angus MacFergus, king of the Picts. The town was renamed St Andrews, and St Andrew adopted as the patron saint of the Picts. Later, the Picts were subdued by the Scots, and Kenneth MacAlpin adopted the banner of St Andrew as the national banner of Scotland. So the white cross on a blue background, with the cross slanted like an X, the cross of St Andrew became associated in many, many ways with Scotland, stemming from those Christian origins of long ago. Significantly, November the 30th is celebrated as St Andrew's Day throughout the world, wherever Scotchmen are gathered. Turn now to the third Christian cross in our flag, the cross of St Patrick. A red cross on a white background, a diagonal cross which distinguishes it from that of St George. As it happens, St Patrick was born in Scotland about 385 AD, and the date, the 17th of March, seems to be associated with him. It is believed he was of noble birth, son of a deacon, Calpurnius, his grandfather also being a priest. When he was 16, St Patrick was captured in a raid by the northern tribes and carried off to Ireland as a slave. During this time, he began to take religion seriously and became a man of intense prayer. After 6 years in captivity, he escaped to the continent and later returned to England. He believed he was called in a dream to return to Ireland to convert the people to Christianity. In the year 432 AD, he achieved his ambition by returning to Ireland as a missionary bishop. And through the efforts of St Patrick, a Christian church was established there. The date of his death, a little uncertain, probably about 469 AD. The cross of St Patrick became the banner of Ireland, being well known by 1690 AD, with the 17th of March established as St Patrick's Day. A British Order of Knighthood, the Order of St Patrick, was instituted by King George III in 1783. So these three crosses in the Union Jack, and now part of our national flag, represent our Christian heritage, that ours is a Christian society. At the last census, more than 11 million Australians stated they were Christian. Our constitution, our legal system, our parliamentary procedures all reflect our Christian origins and Christian principles. That's why these three crosses are so important and why they are such an integral part of our national flag. You may ask then, how did these three crosses come to be combined in what is known as the Union Jack? Again, we must go back in history several centuries. I said the banner of St George was the national flag of England, and this was in use through the reigns of the Tudor kings and of Queen Elizabeth I, who died in 1603. On her death, the crown went to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, the first of the Stuart line of kings. James I found himself king of two countries, each with a distinct and separate flag. In an attempt to bring the two countries together, he ordered that the two crosses be combined into one flag, the Union flag. A century later, in 1707, the two countries were united politically, and the Union flag, combining the crosses of St George and St Andrew, became Britain's acknowledged flag. And this was the flag which Captain Arthur Phillip raised at Port Jackson on the 26th of January 1788. A few years later, in 1801, the cross of St Patrick of Ireland was added. So the Union Jack as we know it was completed, representing Great Britain, including Scotland and Ireland. If we trace the events in Australia, we find that from 1801 to 1901, the Union Jack was the flag of Australia, signifying that the early settlers were in the main migrants from Great Britain, and that Australia was a colony of Great Britain. I said earlier that when parts of Australia were separated from New South Wales and became separate colonies with their own flags, they kept the Union Jack in the upper hoist as a reminder of their heritage. For example, if you look at the state flags of Western Australia, 1870, Tasmania, 1876, Queensland, 1876, New South Wales, 1876, Victoria, 1877, South Australia, 1878. These states used the Union Jack and the blue background as the basis for their state flags, adding certain significant state insignia to signify the particular area. In the 19th century, the Union Jack became part of our military history as Australians went to war behind that flag in the Maori Wars of 1863, the Sudan, 1885, the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1900, and the Boer War in South Africa in 1899. Now look at some of the developments in our own flag and how we've developed traditions about the national flag since 1901. Some of these have been built around war, others around peace, others about international sporting events, and in the everyday life of the nation. In the first decade of this century, leading up to the First World War in 1914, Australia rode the wave of a new nationalism. One people, one destiny, one flag was the catch cry of the times. Poets and songwriters took up the challenge, and if you examine the collection of the flags in that period, you will see that nationalism and patriotism were built around the flag. There's a few examples of popular songs of that day, and you'll notice each one of them has a flag on them. Australia answers to the call with the flag, the Fair Dinkum War Song, the Three Sons of Old England, We'll Fight for Our Australia, the Great Flag Song. These have all been part of our great tradition in poetry and song. And as the great surge of patriotism developed, so the idea of our national flag swept across the nation. School children saluted the flag each morning and pledged loyalty to their country. And they sang such songs as these: Australians all in your flag unfold and proudly wave the banner high, that every nation may behold our glorious standard in the sky. I said we developed our traditions about the flag in war and peace. Traditions are built up over a long period of time, and traditions about our flag are deep-seated. And of course, many people react very emotionally to the flag because of the events in their lifetime. Let me show you a few examples. In the Anzac book from World War I, we will find a very interesting coloured photo of the Australian digger and his New Zealand counterpart holding the flag aloft on Gallipoli. We'll find the photo of the flag being raised at Saddleberg in New Guinea. In Vietnam, the flag was raised proudly whenever the occasion permitted. And there's a photo of the flag being raised in Vietnam. In New Guinea, whenever a town was retaken from the Japanese, the first thing that happened was the Australian flag was hoisted up to signify that it was Australian territory once more. And there's the Australian national flag being hoisted at Kokoda. I said many Australians felt emotional about the flag, especially those who have been in the services, because it is a tradition that those who have served the country in war may have the Australian national flag draped over their coffin at the funeral service. So many people feel very deeply about the flag and its the part it's played in their lives. But also, the flag has been significant in our peacetime. I said the flag was unfurled in 1901. When the new Parliament was opened in Canberra in 1927, and the flag was hoisted over that building significantly, and it will be so in 1988, when it is planned for the new Parliament House to be finished in Canberra. Our national flag will be erected on an enormous flagpole over that new building. On public holidays such as Australia Day, we fly the flag on all the public buildings, schools, and indeed in private houses. Australia Day, our national day, is known perhaps as Flag Day. And there are many other days and occasions during the year and during the years of our nationhood that the flag has played a significant part. In Australia, we have a precious tradition of religious liberty, social order and freedom. We have a parliamentary system which is free and open, unlike that of some countries not supported by a military faction. This heritage of justice and freedom reaches far back into history, and that is why the flag is so significant in its present form. Many people have left the less happier lands to share our rich heritage, to pledge loyalty to the flag of freedom, and they have seen our flag as representing these freedoms. They have come here willingly as migrants and become proud of the flag. It's a beautiful flag, rich in tradition and history, one that identifies Australia's place in the world. Be proud of it, learn to love it, honour it, respect it. The flag is never lowered except after defeat and occupation by a foreign power, which, thanks be to God, has not been part of our history. This has happened in some countries in Central Europe. It has not happened here. The flag is never lowered except after violent revolution, when the whole fabric of society is torn asunder. This hasn't happened either. Governments may come and governments may go, but the flag, representing the continuity of our society, goes on. Let us all see that it flies free and aloft in all its beauty, in all its tradition, for all time.
Ever since time begun, man has found himself bound together in communities. To make those communities work, he's needed government by which he can live securely and with the maximum possible benefits and freedoms to express himself, to raise his family, and to function in the creation that's been made for him. There have been tyrannies where one man or one group of men, an elite, have ruled repressively or in an authoritarian manner. There have been republics, such as in ancient Rome, or such as the type which currently exists in such places as the United States, or the Philippines, or France. And there have been constitutional monarchies, based on the sovereignty of the Crown. Australia's government is a monarchy. It's not a republic because we don't have a president to hold in trust the laws that we have. It's not a tyranny, because we don't have one man or one group of men who wield power in an arbitrary or an authoritarian way without any reference to a law base. Ours is a monarchy purely and simply because we have a queen. Funk and Wagnall's dictionary defines a monarch as or monarchy as a government by a monarch, a government or territory ruled by a monarch, and a constitutional monarchy is defined as a monarchy in which the power and prerogative of the sovereign are limited by constitutional provision. Australian government is a constitutional monarchy, in that we have a queen who's limited in what she can or can't do by the Constitution. A constitution in itself is a legal document drawn up by the people which legally binds government of any kind within a set boundary outside of which it can't legally move. The Constitution is the people's safeguard against tyranny and against despotism. It's our guarantee that the government itself is governed and that it cannot at any tick of the clock formulate a new law which would prevent our being as free as possible within certain moral boundaries. Quick and Garron, in their milestone work on the Australian Constitution called the Annotated Constitution of the Australian Commonwealth, describes the Queen's authority in Australia thus. According to the theory of the Constitution, the Queen is the source of law. The Queen makes new laws. The Queen alters or repeals old laws, subject only to the condition that this power must be exercised in Parliament and not otherwise. It is in the Crown and not in Parliament that legislative authority is, according to constitutional theory, say Quick and Garron, directly vested. Parliament is that body assigned by law to advise the Crown in matters of legislation, and the Crown could not legally legislate without the advice and consent of Parliament. According to Chapter 1, Part 1, Section 1 of the Australian Constitution, our system of government is made up of a federal Parliament, which will consist of the Queen, a Senate, and a House of Representatives. So legally and politically, Australia is governed by a constitutional monarchy which includes the Senate and which also includes the House of Representatives. All three arms of government themselves governed and prevented from exercising extremes of over-government or abuse by the Constitution itself, which is our safeguard and freedom and prevents the government trying to wield too much power. The question arises, how does the Queen govern Australia when she lives in London? That's summed up in Section 2 of Chapter 1 of the Constitution. A Governor-General appointed by the Queen shall be Her Majesty's representative in the Commonwealth and shall have and may exercise in the Commonwealth, subject to this Constitution, such powers and functions of the Queen as Her Majesty may be pleased to assign to him. So the Queen governs Australia through her elected representative here, the Governor-General. The monarchy as a political system is as sound as any other philosophical stream in the world today. Apart from the hiccup which occurred during the English Civil War of the 17th century, the monarchy has existed in Britain since just after the time of Christ. It's provided a stabilizing force throughout history, and it's provided us with some very essential safeguards. The famous British statesman Disraeli last century said of the monarchy, "The wisdom of our forefathers placed the prize of supreme power without the sphere of human passion." Whatever the struggle of party, whatever the strife of faction, there's always been something in this country around which all classes and parties could rally, representing the majesty of the law and involving the security of every man's right and the fountain of honour. What he was saying was that whilst there must be continuing activity on the political front, which at times might even appear to threaten our very way of life, there's always a political safeguard, a safety valve to which we can all turn to ensure that fundamental freedoms and basic rights will never be threatened. In answer to critics who complain that the monarchy is part of an English heritage and we have an Australian tradition which we must now uphold, my question is, with what shall we replace the system of government that we currently have? You see, it's not enough to see faults which might exist in current governmental structures. We must be prepared to consider what viable options are available and which will give us the long-term community of safety which we require of government, whilst at the same time providing us with the traditional freedom which the monarchy has provided over the centuries. You can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Whatever the turn of events in Australian political life, we know that should anything ever happen to our Queen, her son will assume immediate responsibility for the administration of the government. In fact, so finely tuned is the succession to the throne that we know who will succeed to it up to the 22nd or even the 23rd person. And their responsibility on assuming the throne? Simply to hold in trust the laws of Australia, the rights of the people, and the freedoms and responsibilities which are traditionally ours and which no elected government can ever take away through political expediency. The famous British historian Sir Arthur Bryant has said in his work The Spirit of Conservatism, written in 1929, the monarchy today does not direct the state, but it is the permanent mentor of those who do. They change from parliament to parliament, almost from year to year. It alone during life does not change. In a democratic country where the human agencies of government change so frequently, says Bryant, it's something to have ever at their shoulder the wise and experienced advice of a permanent sovereign. But since the crown is necessary as a permanent pivot for the forces of government, much would be lost and nothing gained by an elective throne. And in Australia, that's the type of government that we've inherited. A traditional Westminster system which recognises that governments of themselves have no special virtue. They are there merely to uphold the rule of law and thus uphold the rights of the people. The history of government indicates that governments are always striving to increase their powers. In Australia, the Queen, through her Governor-General, is there to ensure that the elected government of any political persuasion does not reach too far in the name of political expediency to grab to itself too much power. The monarch herself, of course, is limited as well. It's a well-founded system of checks and balances which will always ensure that no one system of government, no one arm of the administration will become too bloated and too authoritarian. The Queen, of course, also has other officers in Australia outside of the structure of Parliament who are there for the protection of individual liberty and individual responsibility. Magistrates and judges, police officers, civil servants, the armed forces are all first servants of the Crown. They're there to uphold the Crown, not the politician. The monarch has a major function both inside and outside of the parliamentary structure. Where her officers abuse their position, she investigates such abuse in a royal commission, which ideally is outside of the control of party political and expedient political control. I think it's important that we spend a little time examining the history of the British monarchy and to learn from it how it relates into Australia and how we can best draw from it for our lives today. The constitutional monarchy belongs with the Judeo-Christian ethic, or that philosophy of life which these days is based on the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The first constitutional monarch in British history was its first Christian king, Ethelbert, who was the King of Kent, who was converted by the first Archbishop of Canterbury, Augustine, who came to England in 597 AD. In a translation of early English law by F.L. Attenborough called The Laws of the Earliest English Kings, he makes the point that Ethelbert's laws are the earliest known written in the English language. They are, I believe, also the first attempt to limit the power and the authority of the king. Throughout Christian history, there's always been a recognition that there's a need for government to be limited, to best preserve the freedoms and the responsibilities of the individual. The early English kings recognized it, and in their laws always gave acknowledgement to the place that Christian thinking played in their laws. The laws of Ine, who was the King of Wessex in the AD 600s, bound him to a constitution framed with the advice and the consent of the English Christians and also the representatives of his people. No barbaric Englishman this, but a man that recognized that government must be limited if it's to give the people the largest possible amount of freedom and responsibility. King Alfred was the first king of a united England, and he based his laws on the Judeo-Christian thinking which limited his power. From the outset, the kings were expected to keep the laws which they themselves set with the advice of their Christian advisors and the advisors from the people. They were there as figureheads to uphold the laws agreed to by the representatives and also to administer them. Of the earliest English kings, Stevenson and Markham say in their sources of constitutional history that yet the king is treated as any other lord. In other words, he was no special person who was able to make an arbitrary law and rule outside of the law. In fact, no time in history has the English monarch ever made a successful attempt at trying to make law of an arbitrary nature. In fact, every time he has, it's been the Christian church which has called him back, or his successor back, to existing constitutional laws which were designed to limit his power. Magna Carta in 1215 was a constitutional document drawn up on the basis of old law to force King John to agree that there were limits to his power and that it was illegal for him to step outside of those limits. Bishop Stubbs, in his Constitutional History of Britain, makes the point that the whole of the constitutional history of England is little more than a commentary on the Magna Carta. Sir Winston Churchill, in his History of the English-Speaking People, says the Magna Carta bound the king to law, and he goes on, the Charter became the enduring witness that the power of the Crown is not absolute. And when in subsequent ages the state, swollen with its own authority, has attempted to ride roughshod over the rights or liberties of the subject, it is to this constitutional doctrine that appeal has again and again been made, and never as yet without success. What Churchill was talking about is that the authority of the Crown is limited by law. Therefore, the government is limited by law, and therefore the constitutional monarchy to which we are joined assures us of freedom and liberty that I believe no other philosophy of government can give, which is not based on the Judeo-Christian ethic of the Westminster system. The modern-day monarchy is based on the bloodless revolution in England of 1688, following years of arbitrary and abusive government by the Stuart kings. Following the revolution, King William III and his wife Mary were appointed monarchs only so long as they were prepared to sign the Bill of Rights, which limited their government and gave Parliament an indispensable say in the government of the land. The Bill of Rights, again a constitutional document, guarantees freedom to those people that live under this constitutional monarchy. Quick and Garran, in their Australian constitutional work, tell us that it is an adaptation of the principles of British and colonial government to the federal system, that the language of the Constitution and the ideas are drawn from the model of all modern governments, the British Constitution itself. The Australian form of government then, the monarchy, is based on years and years, centuries, of working within existing law to produce a system of government which benefits the majority of people and which protects their freedoms. With those centuries of experience behind us, we've got a solid foundation with which we can go on into the future. Of it, the Canadian constitutionalist Senator Eugene Forsey has said of his Freedom and Order essays that the Crown is the embodiment of the interests of the whole people, the indispensable centre of the whole parliamentary democratic order, the guardian of the Constitution, ultimately the sole protector of the people if the MPs, MLAs or ministers forget their duty and try to become the masters and not the servants. And so, as Chapter 1, Section 1 of the Constitution points out, the Queen, the constitutional monarch of Australia, is our head of government. With her to help administer that law is the Parliament, which consists of both the Senate and the House of Representatives. We elect the senators and the MPs who work in the House of Representatives. They're there as our representatives to find out what we as people want and then advise the Queen accordingly. Section 59, Chapter 1 of the Constitution. When a proposed law passed by both Houses of Parliament is presented to the Governor-General for the Queen's assent, he shall declare according to his discretion, but subject to this Constitution, that he assents in the Queen's name, or that he withholds assent, or that he reserves the law for the Queen's pleasure. In other words, the Governor-General, representing the Queen, does not have to sign into law the legislation passed on to him by the Parliament. Section 59 goes on, the Queen may disallow any law within 1 year for the Governor-General's assent. And immediately you say that's tyrannic and that's despotic. It doesn't reflect the democracy in which we live. But my suggestion is that it does. You see, we've already discovered together that the Queen is bound by law herself. She cannot arbitrarily decide what she does or doesn't want about a particular law. She can't say, I don't like that law, so I won't have it, arbitrarily. She's bound by law that if it is the obvious will of the people, she cannot refuse to pass that legislation into law. But what our system of government, the monarchy, does is to protect us from the elected representatives who may lose touch with the electorate. The idea that once a government obtains office, it's free to do as it likes until the next election, no matter how small its majority is, as despotic and as totalitarian as Hitler was or as the Russian communist system is. The government we elect is bound by the law just as much as we are, and as the Queen is. The Queen is there as the head of government to ensure that the Parliament does what the people want, and that the laws it brings in reflect the consensus of the people. Genuine democracy requires a restraint on the appetites of government, which Lord Bryce, the historian, has said all government seek to increase their own power. The monarchy does not wield direct power, but it is there to ensure how power is used. It's there to ensure that all power is not monopolised by one section of the government. And so the majority party of Parliament, the party that are elected by the majority of electors, has the ability to form a cabinet, a committee of men and women who become what's known as the Executive Council. Their responsibility is to advise the Governor-General, the Queen's representative, what the Parliament, as the representatives of the people, decide should or should not be law. Section 62 of the Constitution says there shall be a Federal Executive Council to advise the Governor-General in the government of the Commonwealth. Members shall be chosen and summoned by the Governor-General and sworn in as executive councillors and shall hold office during his pleasure. In other words, the Governor-General, bound himself by the Constitution and in full regard of the law, may hire and fire the men and women who make up the Cabinet and his Executive Council. That's why just prior to a general election, it's the Prime Minister as the Governor-General, chief advisor in Parliament, that goes to him and advises him to dissolve the Parliament so that an election can be held. Senator Eugene Forsey has said the reserve power or the power to enforce certain sections of the Constitution cannot be used by the Governor-General arbitrarily or against the will of the people. The Crown or the Governor-General cannot act without the advice of its ministers. If the Crown refuses the advice of the ministers in office and they refuse to back down, it must find other ministers who will take responsibility for the refusal. The reserved power of the Governor-General to hire or fire is indeed under our Constitution an absolutely essential safeguard of democracy. You know, in past years we've come to regard the Governor-General as something of a rubber stamp, that he's just bound by law simply to sign all law which Parliament passes. The elected representatives make the law and the Governor-General just simply rubber stamps his signature on it. Not so, says Forsey. He says it's the rubber stamp theory which is undemocratic. It makes existing governments irremovable except by their own consent. Such a doctrine is a travesty of democracy. It delivers every opposition bound and gagged into the hands of its opponents. It delivers the people gagged and bound into the hands of anyone in office. The one in office, of course, may loosen the gag and the ropes. In fact, he may loosen them so much that we don't even realize they're there. But he can tighten them again whenever he pleases and as tight as he pleases. This is not democracy. This is despotism. More or less benevolent, perhaps, for the moment, but despotism nonetheless. And so we have the monarchy, the constitutional monarchy, an arm of government bound by law and there to ensure that other arms of government who advise it do so with the support of the people. Of the Crown, constitutional analyst and former Member of Parliament Arthur Cresby has said in his work, Your Will Be Done, if the Australian people only knew it, the Queen is the final legal protector of the whole of the people without regard to party, race, colour or creed. A final check against the peculiarities of the operation of party politics in the control over the machinery of Parliament and over the voices and the votes of the politicians. No bill for an act can become law without assent, royal assent, being given. An assent which can be withdrawn within 12 months of its being given. This final royal check enables the people, if they only knew it, to determine whether or not they want the act and to ask the Queen to withdraw the royal assent if they did not, or to the request be amended according to their will. Has there ever been a time since Federation when the Governor-General has used his power given to him under the Constitution? Only the once. That was on November the 11th, 1975. Putting aside what some might consider to be the somewhat questionable politics which may have been involved in the lead-up to the matter, the Governor-General of the time, Sir John Kerr, had informed the then Prime Minister, Mr Gough Whitlam, that his services as the Chief Advisor to the Crown were terminated because he could not ensure the continuation of a supply of money to keep the government operating. The Governor-General then asked the then Leader of the Opposition, Malcolm Fraser, to form an interim caretaker government on the understanding that he agreed to an immediate general election. One was held, and the results, I believe, vindicated the Governor-General's decision. If he had been wrong, Mr Whitlam would have been returned. As it was, the coalition was put into power with what at the time was a record majority. The Governor-General's actions were correct, in that as the final trustee of the will and the laws of the people, he dissolved Parliament to allow the people to decide on the formation of a new government to advise him. If Sir John had misread the will of the people, then Mr Whitlam quite simply would have been returned, and Sir John, I suggest, would have been looking for a new job. One of the major aspects of the Westminster system of government to which we belong is its Christian base. History records for historians of integrity that the monarchy has evolved as a result of Christian men and women standing up in years gone by and demanding of the monarch, demanding of the government, that it fulfill its rightful role in our lives. Magna Carta, which we've seen helped limit the role of the monarch, was drawn up by the English barons for King John to sign. History records that it was the Christian Archbishop of Canterbury of the time, Stephen Langton, who was the guiding light whom the barons followed, and if it hadn't been for him, some historians suggest the whole move for the Magna Carta would have simply disintegrated. The famous Bill of Rights, which formed the basis of our modern-day monarchy, was the result of Christian Reformation thinking. The Judeo-Christian ethic takes the viewpoint that government needs to be limited. Otherwise it grows too big, too impersonal, too authoritarian, too despotic. Francis Schaeffer, in his work, How Should We Then Live? The Rise and Decline of Western Thought and Culture, makes the point that our modern-day monarchy, with its checks and balances, which we've already discussed, is the result of Christian Reformation thinking. The Reformers, he says, took the view that man in himself is not a perfect creature, following the biblical account of the fall of man in Genesis chapter 3. As a result, says Schaeffer, every person has something in him which tend him away from what we would call the straight and the narrow. Because the government is a creation of fallen man, therefore, to enable him to live in communities of safety, there needs to be a system of checks and balances, particularly on people in power and in government. In our system, the monarchy provides checks and balances that ensure that none of us is robbed of our democratic rights and freedoms which God has given to us. The monarchy itself is not perfect. Neither is republicanism, neither is a system which is controlled solely by a parliament. But with a monarch able to govern the government of parliament and the parliament and the constitution there to ensure that the monarch stays honest, the checks and balances provide us with the freedoms under God that we enjoy today. In the final analysis, though, it really doesn't matter what type of government we have. We'll demand more and more of it if we ourselves refuse to acknowledge our need for moral responsibility and self-restraint which the absolutes of God's word bring. The freest societies in the world, where people have enjoyed prosperity and freedom from barbarism, have resulted by and large in those nations which have held a Judeo-Christian view of the world. And I think it's fitting that our final challenge comes from God himself, that our monarchy will do us no good if we ourselves are not prepared to seek the moral self-government in our lives. It says in my own paraphrase of Proverbs 28 verse 2 of the Bible, when a land or the people in it refuse to accept moral self-government, self-responsibility, it has many rulers, it has big government. But if we become men of understanding, people who turn our minds to knowing and living within the moral constraints which maturity bring, and living within the moral restraints of God, the land, the nation will continue, and the nation will prosper.